right, welcome everyone. I'm going to get us started because we're just after 7 o'clock Eastern time, and we have a lot to cover tonight. We don't have 15 centuries like our last session, but there's a lot in the 20th and 21st centuries that I want to get to. So let me share my screen for you all. Okay, so as with the previous sessions, we're focusing on this question of Christian theologies of power and resistance, and we looked last week at the full span of Christendom and all of its depredations and problems. And so tonight, we're going to be trying to think about, can we move past Christendom? Can we get to a place where that is no longer a part of Christian expectation and practice? So just as a reminder, we're using the Slido interface for some of our interactive pieces. So if you could go ahead, use your cell phone to grab the link from the QR code there, or if you want to just open a browser window, I'll drop into the chat for everyone the link as well. If you don't want to just click that link, any one of those three ways will get you into Slido, and that is also where you can ask questions for the Q&A at the end, and that is the space also where we'll do a couple interactive pieces throughout where you can give some feedback. So please get into that, and here we go. All right, so just a very brief review of our thesis and where we're going in this course. We talked in the first session about this analogy of you encounter a blob that is moving and stretching and growing. And if you're on the outside of that blob, if the blob is Christianity, if you're on the outside, that blob is, you have a religious studies approach to understanding the blob. You're asking these kind of external questions. If you're on the inside of the blob, then you're participating in what we call theology. You are a part of the discourse, the conversation that is going on within Christianity, and you, I would assume, have an agenda within that. You like certain theologies, you dislike certain theologies. You want Christianity to move in a particular direction. And we have two theses to coordinate with these two different lenses that we have for the data of Christian ideas of power. So on the religious study side, just this should be review for everyone, is religious traditions like Christianity, but you could also talk about Islam, you could talk about Judaism, Buddhism. Religious traditions contain multitudes and are multivocal. There is no single person who speaks for Christianity. And in fact, there are many contradictory voices within Christianity. And the same source texts and traditions that can bolster abusive Christian imperialism and Christian supremacy can also provide inspiration to Christian resistance movements and the pursuit of justice and equality. And that is what we're going to spend most of our time on tonight, is some of these alternate voices that have emerged in the last 150 years. Now, on the theology side, my thesis is that Jesus in the early church, and this is what we looked at, especially in the first week, lived a disempowered and colonized existence. And many people in the early church, in fact, I'd argue most of the people in the early church, had a radical anti-imperial vision of the equalizing kingdom of God that was very much in contrast with the kingdom of Caesar and the kingdom of Rome. But then as Christians, and this is what we saw last week, gained cultural and political power, they have often distorted the message of Jesus in the early church and developed theologies to justify domination and greed and other behaviors that were antithetical to Jesus's life and message. But part of the point that I'm trying to make with these two theses is all of that's also part of Christianity. And I don't think we need to be precious about Christianity, because all of that is also included within what we talk about as Christianity. Now, we ended our presentation last week thinking about this European colonialism, the theological trajectory, the practical trajectory that brought us to the place where Europe, in the name of Christianity or name of Christ, colonized the world in early modernity. What we saw, though, in history is as we got into the 20th century, especially, that colonialism started to break apart and be dismantled. And there really was a variety of factors in this. It's not a monocausal sort of thing. So just a few of those factors, you started to have within a lot of these spaces that had been colonized, anti-colonial independence movements that were challenging the colonial regimes that had brought their armies of bureaucrats and soldiers and missionaries to colonize those spaces. You also, of course, have World War I and World War II, and that are really kind of centered within Europe. Obviously, they reach beyond Europe, but because they affect Europe so directly, they really destabilize a lot of the spaces in Europe. And so people's focus and government's focus within Europe starts focusing back internally a lot more rather than on these far-flung imperial conquests. And so the European nations begin giving up their imperial reach. And you also have, right after World War II, the emergence of the United Nations and this different sensibility about how each nation should have its own autonomy, should have its ability to organize and choose its government. And then, right concomitantly with the emergence of the United Nations, you also have the emergence of the Cold War. And so the Cold War restructures the international order. So there's no longer about empires and colonies per se, but it's about these spheres of influence of the United States and its allies and the Soviets and their allies. And so you really have kind of a different model start to take over in the way that the people even conceptualize the world order. Now, when we think about the process of that, I want to show you a few different images of how that actually went about. So this first one, the first map starts in 1914, so right on the eve of World War I. As you can see, the span of all of these empires was quite great, and if you even went back 100 years earlier, you could see it even more in all over South America. A lot of the independence movements had already begun before the 20th century. Now, when we fast forward to 1938, right as World War II is starting to kick off, you can see things start to shrink. So again, I'll go back 1914, 1938, right? A big shift. Now we're going to leapfrog forward even further to 1974, kind of the middle of the Cold War. And as you can see, all of these empires are starting to shrink back down. Nations are becoming independent. Independence movements are emerging, and you have more autonomy in these spaces. And if you fast forward even further from 1974 to 2008, this is more or less the map that we have today. Very few colonies exist today, but we're still living with the legacies of that. Now, if we wanted to tell the story of how that happened, there's really two options, many options, but there's two that I want to highlight. One is we could call the religious studies option of telling that story, that is more thinking about external factors that are shaping that. And then, but then on the other side, we have a theology story or a history of ideas story for how did these empires and these Christian leaders come to give up all of these imperial ambitions. So, for instance, on the religious studies side, you could talk about, and we looked at this last week, how the Protestant Reformation and the wars that it inaugurates in Europe shatter hopes for a united Christendom. There's really no possibility of a united Christendom after the 16th, 17th century, because you just have so many different political entities. On the other side of that, on the theology side, the Protestant Reformations really blow the doors open on biblical interpretation, on the Christian tradition as a whole, and suddenly you have all kinds of new political theologies emerging, including especially the Anabaptists, who reject this entire idea of colonizing and of Christendom. Now, we also looked a little bit at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that tried to bring a close to all of that warfare in Europe. But the Peace of Westphalia also disrupts the large empires at the time and pushes power back to the nation states, and including power over religion within their boundaries. On the theology side, this is the era of the Enlightenment, right? Where you start to have the challenge to these traditional beliefs, traditional narratives, more of a rational conception of humanity and of progress. And you start to hear ideas of secularism in the way that we would talk about it today. I mean, you can talk about the term secular and how and its origins, but we start to think about this separation of religion and state. And then many Christians begin to adopt that and embrace that idea of separating religion and state. On the external factors, you get into the 18th, 19th centuries, you have industrialization and urbanization, restructuring the very ways that we relate to each other, leading to new community formations and different ways of people conceptualizing and thinking about even how they belong to a religion. And on the other side of that, you have this growing ideological and theological commitment. And we really see this, especially in the early United States, but also in Europe, where you have this growing agreement that we need to prioritize individual freedom and individual decision making. And that, if you prioritize that, that makes this idea of coercing other people into a particular religious practice or identity seem a lot less appealing. Right. And so you begin to have people say, well, people should have freedom of conscience to choose what they want for their religion. And then as these ideas take hold, some nations, especially the United States, but also France and other some of these emerging colonies that are becoming nations, begin to adopt a separation of church and state or a separation of religion and state model. And others begin to degrade the role of the established religion. The Church of England does not have nearly as much power today politically as it did in earlier eras. And on the theology side, many Christian traditions begin to accommodate these changes. Most Christian traditions today are quite content not having state power, right? And so you have, and even find freedom in that from being attached to a particular state or a particular political entity. So there really are different ways of narrating. Both these stories are true, right? But one focuses more on the ideas and one focuses more on the historical factors. But Christendom has still left its mark on the world. And so if you look at this map, this is a map of the predominant religious identity within all these different municipalities, regions, sections, nations. And so as you can see, the blue and the red are Protestantism and Catholicism. The purple is Eastern Orthodoxy, and as you can see, the legacy of Christian colonialism and of Christendom and of Christian imperialism is still very much structures the way that our world as we know it operates. I mean, you have this spread of Christianity and particular kinds of Christianity, right? It wasn't just coincidental that there's some sections of Africa that tend to be more Catholic than Protestant. Those were sections that were colonized by Catholics, and also sections that were colonized by Protestants, right? And so we are still living in many ways with the legacy of the Christian imperial spread, even as a lot of these spaces are experiencing a lot more autonomy and freedom today. So I just want to try to offer a slide to narrate the stories we've seen it so far. And so as we've said, that the persecuted, and I would even say the dissident early church had many of its resistance theologies that kind of populated up through the really end of the 3rd century. And then with Constantine and the Council of Nicaea, we have the formation of this concept of Christendom begins to form. But there still are these resistant theologies that are popping up, even within this kind of Christendom. There are alternative voices, alternative perspectives drawing on that legacy of the early church, resisting this impulse towards Christian political power. And we looked last week as well at how in the middle of the 11th century, Christendom splits into East and West, and you have the Roman Catholic Church in the West, the Orthodox or the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East, and you now have two Christendoms, two visions of Christian rule. But even within that, there still are these resistance movements, resistance figures that pop up. And I just wanted to highlight where kind of Julian of Norwich herself kind of fits within these trajectories. She is one of these resistance thinkers, I would argue, who is pushing back on the inherited narratives of Christian power and Christian dominance. And then in the 16th century, these Protestant visions of Christendom begin to emerge. I put some of the green dots in there because some of the resistance movements within medieval Catholicism are kind of proto-Protestant movements. But then as Protestantism emerges, it weds itself to political power, or at least many of the strands of Protestantism that aren't the Anabaptists wed themselves to political power. And so you get Protestant Christendoms that also are doing this colonizing work. So that's the narrative that we've had so far in the last two sessions. Tonight, I want to focus on what happens in the 20th and the 21st centuries. And what we see is just a proliferation in the 20th and 21st centuries of all these different forms of resistance theology and all these different ways of resourcing and reaccessing the vision of the early church in distinction and even often in defiance of these models of Christendom. So before we get into that, I want to do a little interactive thing through Slido here. So I'm obviously using this term resistance theologies, but I want you to try to think, what would you categorize as resistance theologies within Christianity that you heard of or you're familiar with in the 20th and 21st century? We're going to do one of these little word clouds to see kind of what you all are familiar with. So if you want to pop over to Slido, I'm going to pull it up on my screen here so we can all see what we have here. So I'm seeing a lot of liberation theology. We'll talk about that. Feminist theology, womanist theology. Oh, you guys are speaking my language. We're going to hit a lot of these. Nonviolent resistance, the confessing church. Yes, yes, yes. Black theology, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, ecofeminism, Black liberation theology, Mujerista, Liberación, the Poor People's Campaign, anti-Nazi, queer. Name it and claim it. I'm not sure if I would categorize name it and claim it as a resistance theology. I'm whoever put that, I'd be very curious to know how you're thinking about that. Open relational theology, the Jesus movement, progressive Christianity. Excellent, excellent. So much of this we're going to be looking at and talking about in the course of tonight. Fantastic. Good job, everyone. You are anticipating where we're going. So as we're going through some of these forms of resistance theology, there is no way to do justice to all of them. Even if we had an entire semester to really spend looking at all these, and we could spend a week on each of them, we would not do justice to all of them. So we're going to do kind of a skipping stone, rapid fire approach, looking at a whole bunch of these different forms and styles of resistance theology that come out in the 20th century. But really, I would encourage you to go much deeper with all of these, because there are depths, there are profound ideas, there are heroic thinkers in these different trends that I think we could do very well to look at and study in this, especially in the moment that we're in right now. Now, by calling these resistance theologies, I'm purposefully being a little bit vague, because some of these are very explicitly about resisting Christendom, resisting Christian political domination, resisting this colonialism. But others are more about challenging other forms of domination that had grown entwined with Christendom, things like misogyny or racism, right? And we talked some last week about how this kind of misogyny and racism get woven in to these ideas of Christendom and of dominance. So again, by calling this resistance theologies, I'm putting a label on these. It's my label, but hopefully you can kind of see where I'm going with that. All of these forms of resistance theology draw in different ways and in varying degrees on those anti-wealth and anti-imperial themes in the New Testament and in the early church. So, and I'll just say a word for the Christians who are here. I recognize not everyone in this course is a Christian, but for those of you who are Christians, you don't have to resonate with all of these. In fact, many of them are not even going to be in your tradition. But I do want to demonstrate just how multivocal Christianity is and the wealth of resources that we have, the variety of ways that we have of thinking in these terms and through these different movements. So I'm going to go more or less chronologically. Sometimes these overlap, so it's a rough chronology. So first I want to focus on Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement that really emerges in the 1930s. Dorothy Day herself, I would encourage you to go and read about her. She's a very, very interesting figure. She's a blend of an anarchist and a feminist and a pacifist and a communist, and she's a devout Catholic. And she somehow kind of holds all those things together. And she founds this thing called the Catholic worker movement. It starts out as a kind of newspaper, but then it spread. She starts to form centers and houses, and she's doing this in conversation with and collaboration with her mentor, this Catholic theologian Peter Maurin, and they really kick it off in 1933. But then it's still an ongoing thing today. You can still visit Catholic worker houses in Baltimore or in other cities. So there are hundreds of these Catholic worker communities today. They often focus on serving and caring for the poor in their community. They have houses of hospitality. Part of the value of the Catholic worker movement is that they provide services without asking any kind of clarifying questions or do you really need this? If people ask, they give. And I found this just really nice summary by Tom Cornell that I think really captures the ethos of the Catholic worker movement. He says, the movement is made up of people motivated by the teachings of Jesus, especially as they are summarized in the Sermon on the Mount, and the teachings of the Catholic Church, right? So this is not in rebellion against Catholic theology. This is very much in line with Catholic theology. In the writings of the early church fathers and the social encyclicals of the modern popes, to bring about a new society within the shell of the old, a society in which it will be easier to be good. A society in tune with these teachings would have no place for economic exploitation or war or racial, gender, or religious discrimination, but would be marked by a cooperative social order without extremes of wealth and poverty and a nonviolent approach to legitimate defense and conflict resolution. Right, so you can see there's all kinds of different inputs and connections that are being drawn here. Dorothy Day was very much in conversation with communists in her time, and at times would even identify as a communist, although she rejected a lot of the imposition elements of communism and said, no, this has to be through nonviolence and has to be through voluntary. But then she's also got these elements of anarchy and devout Catholicism, right? It's all blended together. So again, we're moving really quick here. So also in the 1930s, there's a document called the Barmen Declaration that is actually in some of the confessional books and traditions of both the Reformed and the Lutheran traditions. What happens is this is in Germany in the 1930s, and as the Nazi Party comes to power, they begin to take over the German Christian church, which it was a kind of semi-unified amalgam of different forms of Protestantism and under the Weimar Republic. And so as the German Christian movement kicks off, and you can see that there's actually, I grabbed a photo of a wedding ceremony in a German Lutheran church in 1932. So this is very early on, right? This is before Hitler comes to power, but you already see the swastika and this Nazi symbolism beginning to take hold within certain branches of the Protestant church in Germany. And so this group of Protestant clergy, Reformed and Lutheran, gather and issue this what's called a synod, a gathering of Christian theologians and leaders, and they push back on this growing trend. And this becomes then a foundational document for what's called the confessing church that resists Nazism, but it's still also a part of these other traditions. And so just to give you a taste of the Barmen Declaration. And again, you can go and just Google it and read the entire declaration. But they say, we reject the false doctrine as though the state and over and beyond its special commission should and could become the single and totalitarian order of human life, thus fulfilling the church's vocation as well. So they don't want the state to step in and take over the church and to try to replace the church. But then the very next paragraph, we reject the false doctrine as though the church, over and beyond its special commission, should and could appropriate the characteristics, the tasks, and the dignity of the state, thus itself becoming an organ of the state. Right? And so you can see in here, they're doing this balancing of church and state need to be separate. They need to have different functions and roles in society. And when either one of them begins to try to take over the other, the Barmen Declaration says that in and of itself is heresy. That is false doctrine, as they phrase it. Right. So, and then this again becomes another foundational document and a way that many different Christians during World War II, during the rise of Nazism, can point to and say, no, theologically, we reject this. Fast forwarding into the 1950s, you have the rise of the nonviolent civil rights movement here in the U.S., and it obviously spreads beyond the U.S. But I will strongly argue that the civil rights movement is not merely a political movement. It is a political movement, but it is not merely a political movement. It's as much a religious movement as it was a political movement. And it draws heavily on the Black theological tradition, the African-American churches, and the forms of theology that had already begun to emerge within African-American Christianity. They adopted Jesus' model of nonviolence and very much model it off of Jesus. But they're like Martin Luther King is also a student of Gandhi and is studying Gandhi and the nonviolent resistance movement within India. But it was also led primarily by clergy, both Protestant, Catholic, but also Jewish clergy, right? And Martin Luther King was very close friends with Abraham Joshua Heschel, so you have kind of all of these kind of groups converging within the civil rights movement. There's this great quote by Bernard Lafayette saying, "It is no coincidence that most of the leaders at the forefront of the civil rights movement in the South were clergy or lay church leaders, undergirded by a prophetic progressive faith, which led to accepting suffering as a necessary requirement in the struggle for justice and freedom." Right? That there's a theological underpinning to the civil rights movement. It's not an exclusivist theological vision, and right there's it's ecumenical, it's interfaith, but there's conviction, there's religious conviction that is the base layer that is actually driving a lot of the action of the civil rights movement. That's why you have religious leaders at the forefront of it. Now, as the civil rights movement is going on, there's a massive shift that begins to take place within the Roman Catholic Church globally. And it's epitomized by what's called the Second Vatican Council, which it was a long council. It lasted for 3 years, from 1962 to 1965. And up until the 1960s, the Catholic Church had a spotty record when it came to democracy and resisting power. So under Pope Pius XII, during World War II and during the rise of Nazism, the Catholic Church officially tried to remain neutral, even as and there's been recent documents that have surfaced and been revealed that really make this clear. Even as the Church was aware of some of the horrors of the Holocaust, they held back. They tried to remain neutral. And so after the World War II, there's a reckoning within the Catholic Church, and a movement emerges that wants to revise the Catholic Church's relationship with Judaism, but also update and bring the Catholic Church into the modern world. Prior to this, the Catholic Church consistently upheld a vision of human rights and was championing human rights, but they had not fully embraced democracy, nor embraced religious freedom for all. And so part of what shifts in the Second Vatican Council, also called Vatican II, is that you have this movement towards embracing human rights and religious freedom for everyone. And beyond just the question of religious freedom, this is a huge change in Catholic life and Catholic liturgy and Catholic theology. And what gets produced in the Second Vatican Council is a series of 16 documents, usually referred to by their Latin names. These revise not only church's relationship with Judaism, they also have a whole section dealing with the church's relationship with Islam, with other religious traditions. It also offers a theological rationale for religious freedom for everyone. And though it doesn't always explicitly speak about democracy, you can find the ways that within these documents from the Vatican Council, the church is endorsing and embracing elements of democracy. So one of the documents, one of the very important ones that comes out of Vatican II is called Dignitatis Humanae. I'm just going to read a little section of it. Again, a much longer document. I'd encourage you to go and read some of these if you aren't familiar with them. In regards, this is referring to the Catholic Church or the Council, it regards in the first place the free exercise of religion in society. This Vatican Council takes careful note of these desires in the minds of men. To this end, it searches into the sacred tradition and doctrine of the church, the treasury out of which the church continually brings forth new things that are in harmony with the things that are old. So they're trying to say this is not a total shift. There's precedent for what we're doing here. The council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. This right of the human person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law, right? Note that we're moving more towards democracy there, whereby society is governed, and thus it is to become a civil right. So here you have the Catholic Church embracing that everyone should have freedom of religion. There should not be a coercive imposition of religion. And this is a big shift, not just within Catholicism. This is a big shift that's also going on within different branches of Protestantism at the same time, right? That there's a downplaying of this colonial Christendom ambition to use Christianity as a coercive force. Now, as Vatican II is kicking off, and as these conversations are beginning within the Catholic Church, there's a new conversation emerging in Latin America as well. And this is what we ultimately will come to call liberation theology. And liberation theology begins within the Catholic conversation and a particular set of theologians, but then it spreads into Protestantism, and you can even argue it spreads into Orthodoxy and all kinds of other branches of Christianity. But it really starts in Latin America among a group of Catholic theologians. So during and after Vatican II, you start to have these Latin American clergy and theologians. They start to reframe Christian theology around this theme of liberation, all within the context of Latin American oppression and colonialism. And an important term here is this is a contextual theology. In other words, they're saying we're not just trying to make abstract principles or state some sort of universal declaration. We want to ground this theology in this particular context of the oppression of Latin American people, and from that draw theological principles and understand the gospel in light of this particular context. Now, what they're doing is they're integrating some Catholic social teaching. So again, this is not in opposition to the Catholic tradition, but it's drawing upon the Catholic tradition. They're also bringing in elements of Marxist economic analysis and the competition between the classes. Again, they're not embracing some of the more violent or coercive implications of Marxism, but they're saying, yes, there's something true about this idea that the poor are the underclass in society, and that they are that there's this perpetual impoverization of certain groups of people. But then they're also using the Bible and thinking about the Bible itself, and some of the passages in the New Testament that we looked at in the first week. The key phrase for really understanding liberation theology is the preferential option for the poor. And that might sound a little strange, but the basic idea is that God prioritizes the needs of the poor and the powerless, and so their voices should be included and championed in theology. In other words, if you're doing theology and you're not thinking about the poor, then according to liberation theology, you're doing it wrong, because Jesus and the early church cared for the poor. And so they're trying to restore this emphasis that the poor need to be at the center of our theological reasoning, our theological understanding. And liberation theology exists in tension with the Catholic Church and its hierarchy. And so you have Catholic clergy leading the movement, Catholic theologians leading the movement, but there's also pushback and even sometimes punishments that come down on these liberation theologians from the hierarchy. And again, sometimes it depends on which pope is in power. It depends on how provocative these liberation theologians are being, how the political context in which they're doing this. But there's this kind of back and forth that's still going on between these forms of liberation theology and the Catholic hierarchy as a whole. So, inspired by these Latin American theologians who are doing this liberation theology starting in the 60s, in the US, you have the emergence of what's called Black theology, also called Black liberation theology. James Cone, who's pictured here, is a very important figure in the formation of Black theology. So Cone is reading the liberation theologians, and he's saying what they're doing with the kind of preferential option for the poor and for the contextual theology within Latin America, we need to do that for Black people in the US. So this is especially about the African American experience. It does also entail the experience of people who are African who were not necessarily enslaved, but really the focus of Black theology as Black theology is on the African American experience. And so it's rooted in the US, and you have scholars and clergy who are trying to think about the Black experience of enslavement and segregation and apartheid. And so it's also important to note, because sometimes I think people misread Black theological tradition, that Black Christian theology is also in conversation with some of these other movements of Black empowerment that are going on in the 1960s, with the Black Power movement that was fairly secular, with these Black Muslim voices like Malcolm X, who are pushing back on Christianity and saying that's the enslavers' religion. How can Black people embrace this religion of enslavement? Right. So some of the more radical statements that come out of Black theology are in part because it's responding to some of these other voices within the Black community that are rejecting Christianity, and it's trying to make a case for how Black people can embrace Christianity without embracing the religion of the enslavers. So just to give you a little sample of James Cone, this is from his book here, A Black Theology of Liberation. He says, God has chosen the Blacks as God's own people, right? Using a metaphor to the people of Israel in the Bible. And God has chosen them not for redemptive suffering, but for freedom. Blacks are not elected to be Yahweh's suffering people, right? Which was some of the theology that was used to justify slavery. He's like, no, that is not the destiny from God for Black people. Rather, we are elected because we are oppressed against our will and God's will, and God has decided to make our liberation God's own undertaking. Right? So again, reorienting theology from the perspective of the colonized and the enslaved, but still reaching back into the Christian tradition and finding these kind of resistance traditions and syncing up with those. Now, one of the passages that there's a strong focus on within this Black theological tradition is on the Exodus story, right? The story of the liberation of the Hebrew slaves from Egypt. And so the Black theology emphasizes not only liberation from these oppressive structures in society, but also liberation from conceptions of an oppressive God who is on the side of empire and the oppressor. And James Cone even says at different points, if God is the white God, if Jesus is the white God who's on the side of enslavement, we must kill him, because that is not the true God. That is the God of oppression, and that is not the God that we would follow or worship. As Black theology is going on in the U.S., there's a whole other movement, and it's focused on South Africa, but it really is a global movement, the anti-apartheid theological movement, again, that is emerging in conversation with Black theology in the U.S. and with liberation theology in Latin America. These things are all coming out right around the same time. The theologians are in conversation with each other, right? Apartheid is this system that has become entrenched, especially by the 60s and 70s in South Africa, where you have the Black South African majority who are being, there's a system of segregation and oppression being led by the white Afrikaner population. And the white Afrikaners, because South Africa was colonized by the Dutch, and so the Dutch Reformed tradition of Protestant theology really takes root in South Africa. You have Reformed theology, Calvinist theology being used to justify apartheid. And even the Prime Minister, Hendrik Verwoerd, was an ardent Calvinist and was using, he was really the one who was really kind of instantiated this form of apartheid. He was using Protestant theology to justify this. And so you then have other voices who begin to push back, also using theology to dismantle the apartheid system. Right? You have Anglican and Reformed clergy, as well as Catholic liberation theologians who also get involved in this, helping to lead the international and the local protests against this whole system. And this becomes this massive global effort from the 1960s to the 1990s to dismantle apartheid in South Africa. But again, it's clergy and these religious voices that are really leading the charge in many ways in this tradition. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu is a very, very important figure, Anglican clergy. If you aren't familiar with Desmond Tutu, go read up about Desmond Tutu. He's a really incredible man. So again, good summary here from John Allen, who's one of the biographers of Desmond Tutu. He says, from the late 1960s, new theological thinking helped change the course of the church's struggle in South Africa. It was part of a worldwide movement which included African theology, liberation theology, and Black theology, right? So you're starting to see everyone's kind of riffing on each other and being inspired by these other forms of resistance. And then they're picking up on that and saying, ooh, there's something important for that for South Africa that inspired by the experience in Latin America, or there's something for South Africa inspired by the experience of African Americans and Black theology that's growing in the US. Now, as all this is going on, you also have an emergence of a self-conscious feminist theological tradition. And so, arguably, and I think very, very solidly, you could argue that you can find feminist theology, if you define it broadly, as women speaking and writing theologically in a way that centers women's experiences in almost every religious tradition throughout history, right? There's all kinds of heroic women who have pushed back on patriarchy, have pushed back on misogyny. We looked at Julian of Norwich. I would, if we're speaking broadly, I would characterize Julian of Norwich's theology as a form of feminist theology, but that she would not have used that terminology, of course. And so there's a consciously feminist theology that emerges in the 1960s after Valerie Salvin Goldstein writes this essay called The Human Situation, A Feminine View, that really kind of kicks off this new conversation within kind of feminist circles and among women theologians who are writing and drawing inspiration from these kind of forms of liberation theology, but saying, what happens when we do contextual theology about women and women's experience? And some of the early feminist theologians were quite radical, especially somebody like Mary Daly, who kind of went back and forth on whether she could even accept Christianity. Because it was so wedded to patriarchy, and she really had some real objections and challenges to this kind of patriarchal order within Christianity. And some of this is coming out of second wave feminism, right? There's this kind of zeitgeist around kind of feminist consciousness that is making its way into these different theological traditions. But today, I'd argue that you can find feminist theology in really every tradition, or just about every theological tradition, every denomination, every confession of Christian theology, including among evangelicals, among Latter-day Saints. My friend Kristen Coes-Dumay is doing some phenomenal work right now on speaking and writing as a feminist, but more within the evangelical tradition, and challenging her fellow evangelicals and pressing and saying, hey, look at the way that patriarchy and this vision of white masculinity has become so embedded in American evangelicalism that it's giving us leaders like Donald Trump and some of these far right Christians who are really desecrating the Christian tradition. So feminist theology, wherever you locate yourself in the Christian tradition, there are feminist voices who are speaking as women within that tradition. Now, as all of this is going on, as you have feminist theology and Black theology, liberation theology, some Black women start coming forward and saying, hold on a minute. Yes, it's good that we have Black theology. Yes, it's good we have feminist theology, but the Black theology is being predominantly done by men, Black men, and the feminist theology is predominantly being done by white women. And so they coined the term womanist theology, which centers on, again, a contextual theology that centers on the experience of Black and especially African-American women, right? That growing out of this dual critique of Black theology that they feel is still too patriarchal, and feminist theology that is still too white. So you have this pressing kind of, we need to center and think about the ways that these forms of oppression overlap. More recently, you also have what's called mujerista theology. There's just begun really within the last decade or so. You're starting to see Latina and Hispanic women speaking from their perspective, again, doing something very similar to this kind of womanist theology, but doing it from within a Latina perspective. So again, there's no way that I can cover any of these with the depth that they deserve. If you have theologians that you want to recommend in these traditions, or you're like, Matt didn't cover my favorite person, put them in the chat. We will include them in the resources that we send out after the course. Because again, we're skipping stone across the surface here. But part of what's going on within womanist and mujerista theology is that they're drawing on this intersectional theory that's fairly controversial in our culture right now, but I think is very well grounded in reality, that they're arguing like that oppression, these forms of oppression actually compound, that racism combines with misogyny and combines with this kind of Christian imperialism, right? And so they all need to be addressed together. You can't just kind of parcel them out and say, okay, Black women just need to do some Black theology and some feminist theology. Those things overlap for them. And so they need to think from within and push back from within their own kind of a context and experience. And again, as these notions of gender and gender liberation are making their way into these different kind of resistance movements and trends, you have the emergence of queer theology in the 1990s. And queer theology is also using these kind of liberation and feminist themes, but it's also speaking to the concerns and identities of the LGBTQIA folks, right? How do they understand theology, especially as a group that has often borne the brunt of Christian negativity and hatred, and been labeled as intrinsically sinful, right? So some queer theologians have even gone so far as theorizing that Jesus himself was gay, right? He's never married. He's surrounded by a group of male disciples. Many Christians push back on that and say, "Hey, that you're reading the white spaces really hard there. That there's nothing indicating that in the text." But some of the queer theologians have pushed back and said, "Well, Jesus does not conform to the gender rules of his time. He is hanging out with women, even when that is kind of culturally opposed, right, or seen as inappropriate. Jesus seems to be pushing back on the gender norms of his own day." So here's a little quote from Marcela Altas Reed, a very important Argentinian queer theologian. She says, "The everyday lives of people always provide us with a starting point for a process of doing a contextual theology without exclusions." Again, she's read all the liberation theologians, and she's bringing that to bear in her context, right? In this case, without the exclusion of the sexuality struggling in the midst of misery. Now, I do want to note, though, because I think sometimes people will make certain claims and say, "Oh, well, this is all just kind of a liberal thing. This is a progressive form of theology." There's actually some fairly conservative forms of queer theology. So especially, there's this guy, Matthew Vines, who was an undergrad at Harvard, came from a kind of evangelical Presbyterian background, and he gets to Harvard and kind of comes to the realization that he's gay and doesn't know what to do with that theologically. So he drops out of Harvard, goes and studies some of these different queer theologians, but then writes still within an evangelical frame and an evangelical voice. Makes the case as an evangelical that same-sex marriage should be embraced by the church as a path for queer folks to live monogamously and according to conventional sexual ethics. He's still opposed to sex outside of marriage. He's like, well, then you need to give us an option for marriage, right? That's actually a fairly conservative cultural argument that he's making. And he's trying to appeal and speak to an evangelical community in that, right? So even something like queer theology actually spans a breadth of the political spectrum that I think a lot of people don't recognize. Okay, last couple. So as queer theology, as feminist theology, as womanist theology, as Black theology is emerging, you also have what's called disability theology that begins, at least consciously, in the 1990s and is still an ongoing conversation right now. And obviously, within all of our religious traditions, there's reflection on infirmity, disability, physical inability. And there's all kinds of conversation about that prior to the 20th century or the late 20th century. But you have this conscious field of disability theology that talks about itself as disability theology that really forms in the wake of Nancy Eiesland's 1994 book, the Disabled God. And again, using contextual theology, liberation theology, but the disability theology starts with the premise that disabled people can also do theology and can speak from and to their own experiences far better than able-bodied people can. So here's a really nice summary by Median Volpe. In a healthy society, the able-bodied are reminded of the frailty of their beginning and their end, as well as the ever-present possibility of disability or illness. But such recognitions do not inspire fear. Disability theology highlights the contingency, finitude, and fragility of human being, which is an aspect of creaturehood, beginning instead from the reality of universal human limitation and the diversity of human experience. So in other words, you don't have to assume that just because somebody is disabled, that is somehow a barrier to them doing theology. In fact, maybe it gives them a lens and an angle on theology that speaks some of the universal human experience in a way that able-bodied people would not even think. And one of the, at least within Christian disability theology, because now there's Jewish disability theology, there's even emerging Muslim disability theology right now. But within Christian disability theology, many of these theologians will especially focus on the fact that when Jesus is resurrected, he still has scars. His body is not perfected in the resurrection in the sense that the deformities or the painful experience of his life are erased, right? But somehow the scars are integrated into the resurrected body of Jesus. And so apparently bodily perfection is not the Christian ideal, right? There's something about the physicality and even the experiences we have in this life that carry over into the next life. Okay, last one. This one I'm guessing many of you probably have never heard of. And this is a concept called philletism or ethnophyletism. This is actually occurring within the Orthodox tradition. So that the term ethnophyletism, again, from the Greek ethnos as in nation and philetikos as in tribal. And so the idea of ethnophyletism it would roughly be translated as Christian nationalism or ethno-Christian nationalism. But the idea is you're conflating the church and the mission and destiny of the church with the mission and destiny of a single nation or race. And unlike the centralized Roman Catholic Church, where you have one patriarch, right, one pope at the top of the hierarchy, within the Eastern Orthodox churches, they developed what's called the autocephalous model, as in each branch appoints its own head. So there's a patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. There's a patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church. There's a patriarch of the Antiochian Orthodox Church, right? And so there's multiple power centers within Eastern Orthodoxy. And so it's not always a perfect analogy when you try to compare it with the Roman Catholic order. And so there was a gathering in 1872 called the Orthodox Council of Constantinople that highlights this emerging trend. And this is 1872. Right? This is around the time of our Civil War, right? But they're already noticing this convergence. As you have the rise of these nation states in Europe, they're noticing this convergence and this way that people are trying to blend these and say, well, our church is the true church, the Russian Orthodox Church is the true church, and everyone else needs to conform to us. And the destiny of the church is wedded to the Russian people, and they condemn that. And they say, no, that is ethnophyletism, right? And you're conflating the universal church with one nation or one race's identity. And so while technically this concept of philetism or ethnophyletism is really more of a question of church governance, right? How is the church governed? What's the right kind of structure for the church? This principle has really gotten stirred up. And there's all these new debates and conversations going on since Russia invaded Ukraine. Because right before Russia invades Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was recognized as an independent branch of the Orthodox Church. This was like I think 2017 or 2018. And so, and the Russian Orthodox Church did not recognize the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as a valid church. They said, no, all those Ukrainians still need to be under the Russian Orthodox Church. And part of what happens when Russia invades Ukraine is there's also a theological claiming of Ukraine to say they're rightfully under the domain of the Russian Orthodox Church. And now you have all these different arguments and fights going on within the Orthodox Church about this concept of philetism. And you have resistance figures, even within the Russian Orthodox Church, who are pushing back and saying, no, this is a wrong way to approach theology, right? And I have a friend in Europe named Regina, who's a part of a lot of these arguments, and she's been telling me about some of the ways that these new debates are emerging within the Orthodox tradition of resistance around this particular historical occurrence. Okay, so now we're gonna do a little interactive thing. So we at ICJS are always trying to figure out what to do more programming about, what people are interested in. So I want to do a little poll and see what are you interested in learning more about? Because as I said, we just really went across the surface of all this stuff. And so what are you interested in learning more about, either through ICJS or just on your own? We're gonna throw this poll up. Let me see if I can access it here. I might need one of my colleagues to let me see. All right, let me see if I can launch it. Okay, can you see that? Did it pop up on your screens? Okay, and you can pick up to 3. Okay, so pick a few of these, and then we'll look together at kind of what you all landed on in terms of what you want, and this is feedback we will pass along to the ICJS staff, and we'll factor it in to our future programming, whether courses or one-off programs. All right, I'm gonna end the poll here. We got almost 3/4 of you participating. That's great. Okay, let me share the results with you so you can see them on your screen as well. What I'm seeing here is The civil rights movement is the highest in terms of the theology of the civil rights movement at 42%, but there's a lot of interest in a lot of these. So again, we will bring that into our conversations about future programming. But I would also encourage you, if you're curious about any of these, go and read up on them. You can find even just start with a Wikipedia article on them, and that will direct you to some of the different voices, some of the resources, some of the core texts of these different movements. And then you can begin to explore further from there, right? And figure out who you want to read and where you want to go. There's a wealth of all of these different ideas and identities that have come to the surface in the Christian tradition that I think are very worth our time. Okay. I'll also just note that we could keep going. Right? We don't have time, but we could keep going. We could talk about Asian theology. We could talk about ecological theology. We could talk about Palestinian liberation theology. We could talk about Dalit liberation theology. The Dalits is the term within India for what are often called the outcasts, right? The lowest caste of people in Indian society. Many of those people have become Christians in the last 100 years or so. And so there's now liberation theology being practiced within India that is often pushing back against other forms of Christianity that are adopting caste mindsets. And so you have forces for liberation and resistance even within the Indian Christian community. These many forms of resistance theology are a big part of what keeps me in Christianity. If all we had was Christendom, if all we had was Christian imperialism, I don't know if I'd still be a Christian. But when I study these movements and study the thinkers and resonate with these voices, even when they're voices that are not speaking from my experience, right? I'm a white man who's heterosexual, right? Like that, many of these are in many ways challenging my faith and my identity, but there's a beauty to them. And I think that the beauty of the gospel, the true gospel, the early church gospel, the gospel of Jesus, shines through under the swamp of Christian imperialism in these forms of resistance, right? To me, one of the most beautiful things about Christianity is that even as you had Christians go and colonize much of the world, and I would argue doing it in an incredibly unethical and horrendous way, people within those spaces could still look at Jesus, could still look at the early church and find inspiration and reject the religion of the colonizers and still find the messages of resistance and hope within the Christian tradition, right? And I think that there's something very powerful about that is worth reflecting on. Also, and I noted this at a couple points, but I just want to foot stomp it. These many forms of resistance theology are very diverse. They're all over the political spectrum, right? You have some of them are quite conservative socially and culturally. Some of them are very progressive, right? They're in every tradition of Christianity. They're creating new traditions of Christianity, and they're even inside institutions and critiquing institutions, right? That Vatican II is a change in the life of the global Roman Catholic Church, right? A change in the way of doing church for Catholics. But then there's also voices like liberation theology voices that are pushing back on the official teaching of the church and saying, hold on a minute, you're missing something here, right? And so I think we need to recognize that not all resistance theologies are anti-institutional, right? Some of them are a part of institutions and reforming these institutions. I also think it's not a coincidence that when colonialism was dismantled and Christendom cracked, all of these beautiful and countercultural theologies found room to speak in the world. There's a reason that we see this flowering, this proliferation of these forms of theology in the 20th century, right? Because that's the same moment when Christendom is being dismantled. And so suddenly there's space for all these other voices to come to the surface. And I think there's something very significant about that. Lastly, and this is my theological conclusion, you don't have to agree with it, but my theological conclusion is that Christendom is a theological bastardization of the message of Jesus in the dissonant early church. That Christendom is a distortion of the message of Jesus. It's part of Christianity. Let me be very clear about that. And the people who participate in Christendom are also Christians. But it is a bastardization of the message of Jesus and the life of the early church. Okay. So as we move towards concluding our course, I want to come back to our diagram here. And I think we also have to recognize the moment that we are in right now. Because even as you have all these new forms of resistance theology, of resourcing the early tradition, we also are seeing new forms of Christendom and Christendom thinking emerge. And so in some ways, one of the questions I have for the time that we are in right now is: are we seeing the empire strike back? Are Christian empires trying to reassert themselves in the moment that we're in right now? Right? In truth, this impulse towards Christendom and Christian supremacy, it never actually disappeared. Right? It lost power, it went dormant in many places, and it was marginalized within the three major strands of Christianity, within the Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant traditions in the late 20th century. And right, that's the crack up that we've just looked at. As you have these more egalitarian and liberal democratic international order taking root globally, right, as colonialism, and whether you want to tell the story as external factors or internal factors, right, the Christendom receded for a while. But now we are seeing new theologies of power surfacing in each of these three strands. And their ambition is to recreate versions of Christendom again. Right? And one of the great global questions, I think, of the 21st century is, will Christendom rise again? And I don't know the answer to it, because I think it's very much an open question. So what I want to do is highlight four of these emerging forms of new Christendoms, of new forms of Christian supremacy that are emerging right now, and then we'll kind of wrap up. So the first is what I call the Russian Orthodox Tsarists. And I already hinted a little bit at this when we were looking at philotism and the debate about ethnophilitism. But this is this reanimated imperial Russian church. And so part of what has happened in the history of the Russian Orthodox Church is under the Tsars, under the kind of Russian Empire prior to the Soviet Revolution, the Russian Orthodox Church was very much in sync with the czars and with the political zeitgeist, and was a dominant force within Russian society. But then, as you have the rise of the Soviets, the Russian Orthodox Church was periodically persecuted and repressed under Soviet rule. You had many Russian Orthodox clergy who were executed by the Soviets as dissidents, right? So even the Russian Orthodox tradition itself produced these different forms of resistance in resistance to the Soviet regime. But then after the Cold War ends, now the Russian Orthodox Church has been reintegrated into Russian life. Now, levels of religiosity in Russia, at least in terms of piety, attendance at religious services, are very, very low. I think it's less than 10% of Russians attend any sort of religious service on a weekly basis. But since 2009, Patriarch Kirill, who is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, has closely allied the church with Vladimir Putin, particularly as you have this invasion of Ukraine. And Kirill, who I think has been very much a bad actor in this space, he has blessed Russian troops. He's held ceremonies blessing these Russian troops. He has used the language of holy war to justify and vindicate Russian aggression in Ukraine. And he has mimicked Putin's authoritarian talking points and saying, well, this is fascism or it's Nazism that has arisen in Ukraine, and so therefore we need to go and conquer it. And again, part of the backstory to this is the Russian Orthodox rejection of the validity of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And so there's a theological attempt, a ecclesiological attempt at hegemony, at conquering Ukraine, even as you have a military attempt at the same time. And Putin sees the Russian Orthodox Church as a crucial component in restoring his ambition of a czarist empire. Putin's not just a Christian nationalist. He's a Christian imperialist. He wants to expand the footprint of Russia. He wants to restore the Russian Empire. And this retrenchment and propaganda that has come from Kirill and many of his associates, and again, there are figures within the Russian Orthodox Church who are pushing back on this. So this is not a universal thing. This is at the top, and then you have these dissident voices within there. But it's sparked these protests among the clergy who are alarmed by the way that the church is syncing up with Vladimir Putin and his imperial ambitions. This is something that I think we need to be paying attention to. And there are not that many Orthodox folks in the U.S., especially not Russian Orthodox folks in the U.S., but this is a force in the world and you have this imperial ambition, this Christendom ambition kind of rising again, especially within the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church. Within the Catholic tradition, I would identify especially these various forms of anti-Vatican II Catholics. There's been really, I mean, there was pushback on Vatican II really from the start. There were Catholics who did not want the church to go through those reforms, who saw them as invalid, who saw them as too accommodating to democracy, too accommodating to modernity, too accommodating to other religious traditions. And so this trend, it goes by different terms within Catholicism. And I'm not Catholic, I'm not an expert on Catholicism. So we can invite other experts in to kind of speak to this in other programs. But sometimes they're called the rad trads, as in radical traditionalists. Sometimes we talk about Catholic integralism, which is more of an intellectual kind of constitutional law tradition. I mean, there are some major Catholic integralist thinkers who are here in the U.S. who are respected globally. Or sometimes it's just referred to as kind of post-liberal Catholicism. Liberal with a lowercase l, as in like liberties and rights, liberal democracy. So they're framing a kind of post-liberal vision of Catholicism. And again, though there are many conservative factions within the Catholic Church, and the one thing that unites many of them is this rejection and criticism of the Vatican II reforms that are seen as too liberal or seen as too modern, right? And sometimes this is signified by an embrace of the Latin Mass, right? Because part of the reform that goes on in Vatican II is that there's a shift. The church moves away from all masses being conducted in Latin, it's the kind of ancient language of the church, into being vernacular. Into now, if you go to most Roman Catholic churches in the U.S., it'll be the service will be in English or in Spanish, right? In whichever country it's in or whichever community is being served, that is the language that's used in the service. But many of these rad trad Catholics are trying to go back to the Latin Mass as a kind of rebellion against Vatican II. They generally see a need for the church to take a more proactive and assertive role in shaping society, and this is especially a phrase you'll find among the integralists, around objective natural morality, by which they mean Christian morality. And Thomas Aquinas, the medieval theologian, is often widely invoked in these circles. I think they have a very simplistic reading of Thomas Aquinas, but he's often kind of held up as a sort of figurehead for this way of thinking about the church. And some of the ideas that are on the table in these circles, I think, are quite concerning. They'll talk about we need to have anti-heresy laws, where people who are guilty of heresy can be prosecuted by the government. We need to have anti-blasphemy laws, that if somebody speaks ill of the church or of God or of Jesus, then they could be prosecuted. They talk about banning books, right? So there's this deeply anti-liberal tendency that has emerged. Now, this is not all Catholics, obviously, right? The Catholic tradition is incredibly diverse, but there is this growing faction within, especially the American Catholic Church, but really the global Catholic Church, that is starting to resist some of the resistances, right? They're trying to re-embrace some of the more imperial Christendom ways of thinking. And this segment, I mean, if you talk to a lot of Catholics who are over the age of 50 or maybe 60, they'll be like, I don't know what this is about, right? This is very weird to me. This does not make sense. But this is especially growing among young Catholics, among people who are going to Catholic universities, Catholic seminarians, often among Catholic converts like J.D. Vance. He is friends and follows a lot of these integralists and rad trad thinkers. And then also within the clergy, there's a growing movement of priests who are embracing some of these anti-liberal ideas within the Catholic Church. And so and especially when we think in the U.S. context about our Supreme Court, the fact that well, I mean, Neil Gorsuch is a little bit debatable. He's sort of Catholic, he's sort of Episcopal, but at least 5 of the 9 Catholic or 9 justices are Catholic, and many of them are steeped in some of these integralist ideas, are in networks with some of these thinkers. So I would argue that the Catholics on the Supreme Court are not representative at all of the mainstream of Roman Catholicism in the United States, but they're very, very influential and when it comes to government policy and especially within the judicial branch. Okay, finally, we come to my people, the Protestants, and I want to highlight two of these Protestant movements. One is what we would call the radicalized Reformed crowd, sometimes called the Reconstructionists. Colloquially, they're often called the Theo Bros. And this crew, very hardline in their theology. They're grounded in Calvinist theology. That's what we mean. Reformed is a synonym for Calvinist. With some of these older ideas, and you can trace these even back to the Reformation and to Calvin and some of the early Reformed thinkers about the coordination between the church's role and the government in morally influencing society. I mean, Calvin, as much as I appreciate the theology of John Calvin, he's got some warts, right? He participated in the execution of a heretic named Michael Servetus in Basel. And so I think we need to be conscious of the ways that this is not entirely new, right? They are drawing upon some of the resources and sources of the Reformed tradition. Now, a movement of these theologians called the Reconstructionists, centered around a guy named R.J. Rushdoony and his son-in-law Gary North, emerges in the 1960s. And they were advocating for the gradual Christianization of society through the application of biblical law. And you may have never heard of R.J. Rushdoony or Gary North, but they were pivotal thinkers in what we talk about as the rise of the religious right, as you have evangelical voters consolidating around the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan and in the Reagan Revolution in 1980, and all the way up until today. And they've really kind of radicalized a whole segment of evangelical leaders around these ideas over the last 5 or 6 decades. Some of the keywords that you might note if you're encountering some of these folks, they like to talk about theonomy, which is just theo is God, right? Nomos is law, so the divine law applying biblical law to society. And some of these Reconstructionist thinkers will say unrepentant homosexuals need to be executed. People who commit adultery need to be executed, right? They're going back to the Levitical law and saying this is relevant for today and needs to be applied today from the government down, right? They also will sometimes talk about postmillennialism, and we can have a whole conversation about eschatology if people are interested. But the basic idea is that you build the kingdom of God on earth. You don't wait for Jesus to come back. You build the kingdom of God on earth now. They also talk about presuppositionalism, which is, again, a fancy word for just rejecting any truth that does not come from God, from Christian doctrine. And they also really love this word dominion, the idea of Christians taking power over society. This is not, I did not create this graphic here. This is actually a literal Reconstructionist conference that happened last year. It's called Blueprints for Christendom 2.0, right? That should tell you something about how they're thinking, right? So they are completely embracing this idea of Christendom and rebranding and reinvigorating Christendom, recreating Christendom. And I'll just note that Pete Hegseth, the newly appointed Secretary of Defense, very influenced by these folks. He attends a Reconstructionist church, has gone on their podcast, has espoused agreement with their entire philosophy. In fact, much of the impetus behind the Christian homeschooling movement comes out of these Reconstructionist reform circles. They also often embrace very militant visions of Christianity, valorize the Crusades. Pete Hegseth has multiple tattoos of the Crusades on his body. They emphasize male authority over females. There's a very, very patriarchal and misogynistic movement. And they even talk openly about recreating Christendom. In fact, some of these guys, I have a picture here of Joel Webbin, who's one of the more prominent pastors in this movement. He's openly advocated in the United States for the repeal of the 19th Amendment and taking away the right of women to vote. And he's very, very popular, right? He has many, many followers, many people who agree with him on this. But he's openly arguing that women should not have the right to vote because women vote liberal, and their husbands or their fathers should just vote on their behalf in order to protect the patriarchal order of society. So there's some very, very what I think in the past we might have called fringe ideas. These are popular right now, especially in the far right, and are taking root in real communities right now. And I think I would not be surprised if we started to see some of the policies of the incoming Trump administration very much influenced by these Reconstructionist ideas, because they're very influential in a lot of policy circles. Okay, last group, and this is I'm going to go quickly here because I wrote an entire book on this. So if you really want to understand this group, please go read my book, or I did a whole podcast on it as well. So I'm not going to linger on it too much. But this group I'm calling the Seven Mountains Spiritual Warriors. Sometimes they're also called the New Apostolic Reformation or Dominion Theology, and this trend is located primarily within this very fast growing Pentecostal charismatic segment of global Christianity. Pentecostalism emerges in the early 20th century, mostly out of Protestantism. And then there are charismatic Catholics, there are Pentecostal, denominational Pentecostals, there are independent charismatics. A lot of the leaders of this are coming out of the non-denominational wing of the Pentecostal charismatic space. And they champion this idea of what's called the Seven Mountain Mandate. And this guy, Lance Wallnau, who's pictured here, is the one who first articulated this idea. But they divide society up into all these different arenas of influence. So family, government, education, arts and entertainment, media, business and commerce, science and technology. And what they say is each one of those in every society is a mountain. And the top of that mountain is either controlled by Satan and the demons or by God and the Christians. And Christians, and they believe in modern prophecy, so they say this is a prophecy, this is a command from God. Christians need to go and conquer all seven mountains in every society. Very much a Christian supremacist vision, but again, in the background of this is Christian imperialism, right? It's just Christian imperialism warmed over. And so they believe in this elaborate demonology. They have all kinds of different demons. And in the 2024 election, they were especially calling Kamala Harris part of the Jezebel spirit, or that she was possessed by the Jezebel spirit. They often accuse their political opponents of being possessed by demons. They engage in what's called spiritual warfare to dethrone these supposed demonic hierarchies. And just to give you a sense of the way that this often plays out in the US, one of their favorite word plays is they say the Democrats are actually the Demoncrats. Right? They literally demonize their political opponents and say that our political opponents are invalid because they're inspired by demons. We shouldn't even listen to them because it's just demons speaking through them. Now, though this group was fairly popular in the kind of evangelical grassroots world, these leaders were pretty marginal until Donald Trump, at least in the United States, until Donald Trump came on the scene. And he brings, and I can tell the whole story of this, and I do in my book, how this process came about. But basically, very early on in his campaign in 2015, in fact, Donald Trump started bringing a bunch of these leaders into his inner circle of religious advisors, and that gave them a lot more political cachet in the religious right. In the past, they were kind of marginal and not very well respected in religious right circles and elite religious right circles. But now they've gotten into the inner circle, and they become, these folks are quite extreme in their theology, very much embracing ideas of Christian supremacy. And many of these leaders were very heavily involved in January 6th. I have tracked about 60 independent charismatic leaders who were in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And they've infused contemporary evangelicalism. These ideas have spread outside of their own circles into broader American evangelicalism with this new militant Christian supremacist theological vision, very much built around Donald Trump, and they have all these prophecies about Donald Trump, and so there's this kind of fixation on Donald Trump. But some of these same leaders were very focused on bolstering and supporting Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and many of the same leaders and networks that were heavily involved in instigating the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021 in the US, 2 years later were very involved in helping to instigate the Brasilia Capitol riots in Brazil when Bolsonaro was pushed out of office, right? So a lot of these networks are actually transnational, and they have ambitions for global Christian supremacy. This is not just about Christian nationalism in the US. This is about reaching beyond the borders of the US in order to create this global Christian hegemony. Okay, so here's what I want to do. As we got 10 minutes left, so we're going to do one more little interactive piece here. So if you want to kick on over to Slido, and for this last one, what I want to focus on is your reaction to all of this, and I want you to think about if you're a Christian, think about where have you seen some of these ideas popping up. And this is a long form answer, so feel free to write a sentence. Where have you seen some of these theologies emerging or operating within your own tradition? Where have you encountered some of these ideas? Where maybe it's in your family, maybe it's maybe among your neighbors, maybe you've just seen it on the news. And then if you're a non-Christian, so right, that's the theology side. On the religious study side, if you're a non-Christian, which of these feels like the most potent threat to pluralism today? What has you most concerned? So go ahead and pop over to Slido. This is the third question in there. It should be pulled up in Slido if you go over in there. And just feel free to, and I'm going to go ahead and share the screen so you can see other people's answers as well. I'm just going to start reading some of these so that because I'm sure there's going to be a bunch. So somebody noted that some of the anti-gay sentiments within their own family. In the Reformed Calvinist church planting networks that have targeted cities like my own in Boston, yes, there's a growing movement of new church plants, especially out of these kind of very Calvinist, Reconstructionist kind of movements. Variations on white Christian nationalism in all its forms, and people in their own family believing that the end times are coming, so they're embracing this. And yeah, apocalyptic reasoning is a big part of this. Somebody is noting kind of canon law and the way that factored into some of the child abuse scandals within the Catholic Church. Congregations in conflict between pastors who preach Jesus' love, mercy, and compassion, and congregants who call that theologically sound preaching woke heresy. Yes, this is a thing right now. There are many pastors who are very, very afraid to speak out about some of the far right politics in their own congregation because they're getting kicked out of those. Contemporary Christian music. Yes, a lot of these themes get integrated into evangelical music and the soundtrack of evangelicalism. The forms of hatred, dismissing and demonizing mainline Protestants. Yes, they're quite antithetical to mainline Protestants. The Christian nationalism that's rising all over the world, even in the global South. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church and the PCA, those are other more conservative Calvinist trends. The Christian conservative takeover, the Christian Reformed Church, another Calvinist church. Within younger priests and what they preach in their homilies. This is in the Catholic one, right? I also see it on college campuses where organizations, groups, older adults are trying to convince young people of the rad trad principles, right? As I was saying, a lot of this is among young Catholics and often Catholic converts like J.D. Vance. Most concerning is that Trump has selected some of these folks to be in the government. Quite a few of them, in fact, are coming in with the new administration, especially people like Russ Vought and Pete Hegseth, Mike Huckabee. More conservative seminarians in the Catholic diocese, people who are Jewish being very concerned about the ways that this is spreading. And again, we can share more of these in the follow-up if people are really interested. Late Great Planet Earth, that's another kind of evangelical text from the 1970s. Mike Johnson has an appeal to heaven flag, which is very much associated with some of these Seven Mountains folks. Okay, so you guys are dialed in. You are concerned about the right things, I think. And so let me wrap it up, and then we'll have some time for questions. And again, please put your questions into Slido. There's another segment of Slido that you can use to input your questions. Or if you can't figure out Slido and you're like, I don't know how to do this, feel free to go ahead and just put your questions in the chat. There's one of my colleagues has marked themselves as submit questions here, and they'll put those over into Slido if you can't figure that out. Okay. Last couple slides here, and then we'll do a little Q&A. Okay, last few thoughts. As I said, as we were leading into this last section, one of the critical questions of the 21st century is, will Christian imperialism and Christendom return? You have these different groups, these different factions, these different movements that have that ambition, that have that hope. And I don't know if you all picked up on it, but it even showed up in Donald Trump's second inaugural address. So again, a lot of these prophets around Donald Trump have become very fixated on him, and especially on the assassination attempts against him, and seen those as the fact that he survived these assassination attempts as a fulfillment of their prophecies. And Donald Trump has picked up on their rhetoric. And so when he said in his inaugural address, "I was saved by God to make America great again," that is a theological claim. Right? He's saying God was the one who saved me for the purpose of being in this office. Right? That's coming very, very close to a sort of Christendom notion of the divine right of kings. Right? Donald Trump is a figure of destiny, and so whatever he does must be sanctioned by God. And then he goes on, and he's using the language of Christian imperialism. Right? The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars. Manifest destiny is the American phrase for Christendom. Manifest destiny is the idea, well, God has ordained our nation, and so whoever we have to conquer, whatever native peoples we have to eradicate in order for our nation to expand, is justified because we're a godly nation, right? And there's all kinds of racism and Christian imperialism attached to that phrase. It's not accidental that Donald Trump invoked that in reference to Mars, right? And if you look at Donald Trump and the changes that have gone on in his discourse, in the way that he talks from the campaign to his administration, there's been a marked shift in his ambition to expand the footprint of the United States, taking back the Panama Canal, taking Greenland. He just yesterday declared that he's going to take over Gaza. Not totally clear what that means, but right, there's this element of imperialism that is now being infused into our politics. In the first Trump term, it was much more about nationalism, about shoring up the borders, about protecting and defining who is American. Now there's this other ambition, and it often is now paired with the ambition to persecute the enemy within, right? A focus on eradicating voices of opposition and resistance within the US. For the first time, I would argue, since the 4th century, as we are facing again this crisis of Christendom, for the first time since the 4th century, resistance theologies actually have some real institutional heft and widespread support, right? That Constantine really eradicated a lot of that in the 4th century. But now, as we've had this flowering of resistance theologies in the 20th and 21st centuries, now we have a lot of voices that are pushing back on these ideas. But we should not underestimate just how deeply ingrained, how powerful these habits of mind of Christian supremacy that have been cultivated within the collective Christian imagination. There's many Christians who probably don't even think about it, but just assume Christians should be in charge. In the same way that many white people don't even think about it, but just assume that white people are the normal people and should be in charge. Many Christians, because they have been shaped, their imagination has been shaped by Christendom and Christian imperialism, think that Christians should be in charge. And I'll end with this. As it was in the 4th century, it is today. None of this is predetermined. Right? None of this is all kind of fixed and inevitable. Right? So those of us who are Christians, we have a role to play. In fact, I would argue we have a duty in pushing the blob towards pluralism, towards religious freedom, towards interreligious friendship without domination, right? Those principles are also there in Christianity. And those of us who believe in those things, I think we need to find our theological voices in this moment, because the propaganda, the threat is not just political, it's not just authoritarian, it is theological. And for those of us who want to stand against it, we need to find our theological voices and challenge it. And I hopefully in the course of our study together, you found some different resources that can point you in good directions. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and move over to the Q&A. Again, if you need to go and can't stay for Q&A or aren't interested in hearing me blab on anymore, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining our course. When you sign out, whenever you sign out of this course, you will get a survey that will pop up. Please fill that out. We read all these surveys. We take them into account. We try to structure our courses around them. Give us your honest feedback. It's anonymous. We will take that and we will work with that. So please take the time to fill that out. Okay, I'm going to move over into the Q&A. And again, if you need to hop off, you can please do so. And thank you again. Let me see. You got a whole bunch of questions, 17 questions. Good. Okay, we will. I'll try to get into as many of these as we can, and maybe stick around for 20 minutes or so. So again, no worries for those who need to hop off. So how do these evangelical Christians define Christianity? I.e., what does Christianity mean in their daily lives and their morality? How can they do away with USAID? I grew up evangelical. I think for many evangelicals, there's been a deep individualization of Christianity. And so you hear this in this language of it's about my personal relationship with Jesus, right? This kind of pious fixation on the individual. that often comes at the expense of community and often comes at the expense of justice, right? Because if it's just about me and my personal relationship with Jesus, that doesn't seem to have any ethical implications for how I interact with the world. And so I would argue that that in and of itself is a distortion of Christian theology, because if you go and look at the teachings of Jesus, if you go and look at the life of the early church, yeah, sure, they had a relationship with Jesus, and that was meaningful to them, and it was mystical and it was pious, but it resulted in action. It resulted in seeking justice. It resulted in resisting the empire. It resulted in caring for the poor and the disenfranchised. And I think that too often evangelicals have slipped into this kind of more and more for me and mine mentality that is not particular to evangelicals. That's just a human impulse. But I think they found ways of justifying that theologically to make it about my own salvation as opposed to justice in the world. And Jesus cares about people's salvation, but they're people are not just souls. People are also bodies. And that is a very deep principle of Christian theology that is often forgotten in evangelical circles. Um, let me see. Who are the people pictured in the Catholics for Trump photo? I'd have to go back and look. I know that Newt Gingrich was on there, Mary Madeline, Matt Schlapp, Katrina Campins, and Marjorie Dansfelser. That was just one poster. There's a that coalition is much bigger than just those five people. But that's the advisory board for one particular brand of Catholics for Trump. I mean, Donald Trump in 2016 and in 2024 won a majority of white Catholic votes. In 2020, he narrowly lost because Joe Biden was a white Catholic. But he has gotten very robust support among the white Catholic community. And so those folks are figureheads of the movement, but it's much bigger than just the leaders. So here's a question about Black theology. So would Cone have to a word of contention with the traditional Black religious leaders of redemption from the racist oppressors? I'm not totally sure what that question is asking, but at least in the sense that yes, James Cone did push back on a lot of other forms of African American theology, saying that they were either too conformist or too willing to accommodate some of these the racism and imperialism of white Christianity, were too much in sync with white Christianity, and he's coming from a place where he's not necessarily against people who have white skin, but he's very much against whiteness as a concept. That in and of itself is an imperial concept. If you're interested in going deeper on that, I would especially recommend the work of Willie James Jennings, who's at Yale Divinity. He's done some excellent work on kind of drawing on some of the themes of Black theology, but also kind of speaking more broadly to the Christian tradition, but really thinking about the ways that race got integrated, and especially anti-Black racism got integrated into white Christianity, and what would the process be for extracting that. So he's not only speaking to kind of Black audiences, but he's also trying to speak to white audiences and challenge them and invite them into a different vision of Christian theology. So somebody says, Christendom forces are united. How well organized are resistance forces? Not well at all. I think this is one of the real challenges that we face right now. Is some of it is structural, some of it is cultural, but the religious right in the United States has spent really the last 4.5, 5 decades building an infrastructure of activism, of political engagement, of voter mobilization, of insinuating themselves into positions of power, of building legal networks, of building policy think tanks. And all of that has come to fruition in the Trump era in a very, very dramatic way. And we are seeing right now a moment where all of their efforts are paying off in spades. And there's not really an analogical comparison to the religious left. The religious left is much more diffuse. I mean, there definitely are Christian progressive and centrist activist organizations, but they pale in comparison in terms of funding, in terms of numbers, in terms of influence and reach to the Christian right. And I think this is a moment where Christians of goodwill need to band together against some of this stuff, because the insurgent trend is much more in the direction of this kind of Christian imperialism and Christian supremacy. And those of us who want to resist that, again, that's why I think we need to find our theological voices, because saying like, that's bad Christianity is not enough. Or saying like, oh, that's not Christian is not enough. We need to challenge it and persuade people, and we need to use our theological vocabularies for that, because the propaganda is theological, and so the response needs to be theological. It's not enough to just say, oh, it's about human rights, right? Because that's not going to persuade the people who are being persuaded by it. So that's part of why the next book I'm writing is a theology attacking this Christian supremacy and Christian imperialism. Okay. Does Putin self-identify as a Christian? Yes. In fact, Putin frequently participates in religious rituals in the Roman, or excuse me, in the Russian Orthodox Church, and very much uses those. I mean, if you go and search in Google Images Vladimir Putin Russian Orthodox, and there's just dozens of photos of Putin, often with Patriarch Kirill, and he very much uses and leverages this appearance of piety, this appearance of devotion, to then validate his own imperial ambitions, right? And to say, see, I've got the sanction of the Russian Orthodox Church. The church hierarchy is behind me, and therefore what I do is righteous and good. And that is a very dangerous mix. And it's part of how the propaganda works within Russia, and part of his own self-justification of his regime. Is there guidance on a way to understand when someone moves from resistance or marginal theology into truly a heresy? That's a very good question. I think heresy is a very hard term to define if you're looking at the Christian tradition writ large. I think there is heresy. I'm not denying that it's a real thing and a real category. I would say so I think sometimes people think of orthodoxy and heresy as, here's the right things you have to say. You got to say the Nicene Creed. You got to agree with the Chalcedonian definition, and like you go down the line of all the different creedal statements. And as long as you say the right things about God, you're orthodox. And if you say the wrong thing about God, then you're a heretic. I think the better way to think about it is the creeds structure the playing field of Christian theology. They define the boundaries of Christian theology. There's a lot of room to play within those boundaries. There's certain things that for instance, if you say that Jesus is not God, well, according to the Nicene Creed, that's heresy, right? But if you say that Jesus is God, there's all kinds of other things you can say about him that are not heresy, even if they are not in the creed, right? So the creed is more about defining the boundaries of language that we can use and the boundaries of human conception. But that's a big playing field, and there's lots of room. And I think I take great inspiration from Julian of Norwich in the way that she does this, right? Because she is Orthodox. She is rooted in the teaching of the church, but she's also pushing back on it. She's also talking about God as mother, and the Trinity as mother, and Jesus as mother. That's not in the creed, right? And many people have denounced that as heresy because it's not in the creed. It's also not rejected by the creeds. Right? So I think we need to think about orthodoxy in more capacious ways, and also as a non-coercive force within Christianity. That there's room for Christians to debate. The early church disagreed with each other, right? Paul and James disagreed with each other. And I think there needs to be room within Christianity. As much as I value the concept of orthodoxy, we also need to have room for recognizing like there are multiple forms of orthodoxy, multiple traditions that are in conformity with the teachings of Jesus, and we don't need to keep playing the same heretic hunting games. Okay, do these theologies rise up because people felt excluded from the male-dominated theologies? Absolutely, yes. In fact, one of the great shifts that has occurred especially in the 20th and 21st century, is the elevation of women's voices in the church, of female theologians and female pastors, female religious leaders. And again, you can go back and see there were all kinds of female religious leaders in the early church as well, but their voices were often downplayed or forgotten, I would argue, in part because of this Christendom paradigm that wanted to center things around men and around male emperors and male priests, that then almost intentionally forgot about some of these female voices. But we can find people like Julian and Catherine of Siena, and there's all kinds of important female figures throughout Christian history who've contributed to Christian thought. But what we've seen in the 20th and 21st century is just an explosion of more and more female voices. I think much to the betterment of the church. I think it has brought a much more healthy and balanced set of theological ideas and conversations to the surface that were in some ways kind of suppressed by the patriarchy of Christendom. And that liberation of women's voices has brought about a sea change in Christian theology, at least in my view. Okay. I would request for Dr. Taylor to speak on Bishop Buddy's plea for mercy directed at Trump and the National Cathedral and the response by Trump and his supporters. Okay, I will try not to curse. Yes, so for those who might not have caught it, Marion Buddy, a bishop in the Episcopal Church, at this prayer service, I think it was the day after the inauguration, not in an aggressive way, but in I think a very heartfelt and genuine way, directly addressed Trump and pleaded for mercy. I think everything that she said was entirely consistent with Christian principles and ideas, and there was nothing particularly even necessarily political about what she was saying. She was just saying that many people in the country are scared and are worried right now, and can you have mercy on them? That's an entirely appropriate thing for a Christian clergy member to say and to do, and speaking truth to power, asking them to kind of change the way that they're operating. The backlash against her was extremely intense. Some of the people that I track and follow in these kind of Christian supremacy circles were calling her a witch. Were attacking her as having this political agenda, for forsaking the gospel, for not giving the whole picture, as though somehow she's supposed to give the whole picture in 5 minutes. So I think it was an incredibly brave thing to do, and I know people who know her. I don't know her personally, but I know people who know her. She has experienced a great deal of backlash for that, and even having people impersonate her online and on social media and things. So I think what she did was incredibly courageous. I'm very grateful for her voice. We need 1,000 Marian Buddies right now. We need many more Christian leaders to step up and speak out. And frankly, in the environment that we're in right now, that's going to mean that a lot of them will lose their jobs, jeopardize their careers, and even potentially face prosecution if some of the Christian supremacists that have political power right now get their druthers. And I recognize that's hard, but that was also the experience of the early church. And whoever said Christianity was going to be easy. How do you deal with horrific oppression that is not religious or idealistic at all, though it exploits religious movements? I'm not totally certain what's behind that question. It would be very nice to have an example. But maybe to take it in one particular direction, I'm not sure what the questioner was asking, but I think especially when we think about like the abuse scandals, and I'm not just speaking about the Catholic Church. There's been a whole raft of Protestant abuse scandals, especially right now, emerging in this kind of non-denominational space. I think that we need to recognize just how much that's just part of human nature, to try to dominate and harm each other. We find that all across religious traditions. Secular people try to dominate and harm each other as well. It's particularly egregious and disgusting when people use theology to justify or to cover that. And because I think it's an extra violation. It's adding spiritual abuse on top of often physical and emotional abuse, and that the pain that inflicts on the victims is absolutely horrific, and has driven many people away from Christianity. And I guess I'll phrase it this way: those people who perpetuate that will face the judgment of God. And I think if there's anything we learn from the teachings of Jesus, it is that very impulse to dominate each other that Jesus taught against and challenged his followers to resist, right? And we looked at this in the first week. Jesus is calling his followers to be the slave and the servant of all. It's not, I don't know how you could possibly read the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels and come away with a message of Christian supremacy. Because Jesus is calling his followers to think of themselves as lower than other people, right? And Christian voters should, of all people, be the people who are voting on behalf of the poor, not for their own interests, but for other people's interests, right? That's the teachings of Jesus. And yet somehow we've gotten into this mode of Christians thinking that they need to protect themselves and shore up their power in society. I think that's antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. Okay. Um, what type of theology will help Christianity stand against the conservative movement in the world and in this country? I'll end with this. So I'm writing a book on this very question right now, and so I think I very much value all of these resistance theologies. Sometimes I think they feel hard to access for people who are not trained in theology, and for people who have a more lay Protestant or evangelical sensibility of it's just me and the Bible, right? And this comes out of kind of Protestant ideas of sola scriptura, and also this kind of individualization of evangelicalism. So at least the approach I'm taking is I'm trying to write a book that speaks in an evangelical vernacular, speaks to evangelical audiences. Again, I speak evangelical natively. I grew up in that world, but that really draws on some of these resistance theologies and themes, but grounds them very deeply in the Bible, and particularly in Protestant circles, because of the centrality of the Bible and the authority of the Bible. If we're going to be making arguments with Protestants, we need to use the Bible. We need to know the Bible. We need to study the Bible. We need to become literate in the Bible. Now, within Catholic traditions, there's a variety of other sources of authority, and you can appeal to Vatican II. You can appeal to church social teaching, right? There's a range of recognized authorities. Within Protestantism, it really is the Bible. And so I'm trying to write using a kind of exegetical approach, but also drawing on the life of the early church, to really recognize the colonized context of the early church, and then to push back on these ideas of Christian supremacy and show just how deeply antithetical they are. And just I can send out with the resources. I did a kind of preliminary essay called "The Colonized God" on my Substack. That is kind of it was in some ways the inspiration for, or at least the launching pad for the book that I'm writing. So please, we'll send that out. And I again, I welcome your feedback on that as well. Thank you all.